Hello and welcome to U.S. History 1301. I'm Dr. Seraphine, and today we're going to discuss historical methods and the tools of the historian that you will cultivate and develop over the course of this semester. You've probably already looked at the syllabus and you've probably looked at this module's module overview. So you've noted that these are the historical methods and the marketable skills that you're going to be building this semester throughout your work. In your first two content modules, this module and in module 1, we're going to focus on analyzing and interpreting primary and secondary sources, creating an argument through the use of historical evidence, and appraising ethical decision-making. Now, these skills also map to what the college has identified as marketable skills, meaning these are skills that are transferable not just to other classes, but to your professional career as well. Specifically in our first two content modules, you'll be cultivating written communication. You'll be cultivating a historical perspective on present day events, as well as examining how historically informed thinking relates to contemporary issues of equity. Before we jump in any further to our discussion of these historical methods using the figure of Christopher Columbus, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page with what does it mean when I say primary and secondary sources? You'll note a couple of definitions here. A primary source is an original historical document, which historians use as evidence about a historical period or event. Whereas a secondary source is a scholar's interpretation of and or description of a description of a historical period or event, which relies on primary sources. So secondary sources rely on primary sources to create an argument about history. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated sometimes. Some sources can be a primary source of one thing and a secondary source of something else. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. But just to get you running, primary source, a source from the historical period that you're studying. It doesn't have to be someone that saw the event. They may have written about the event in their diary. That's a primary source. A secondary source is the argument that you or I or another historian makes using those primary sources. We're going to discuss the subject of history and historical methods using Christopher Columbus. So first, I want you to take a moment and pause the video and think for 30 seconds, 60 seconds. What do you know about Christopher Columbus and where or how did you learn it? I'm going to drink some coffee while you think about that. All right, if you're back, you've just thought about Columbus, maybe for the first time in years, to remind yourself, what do I know about Christopher Columbus, or what do I think I know about Christopher Columbus, and where did I learn that? Many of you probably thought, well, I know he sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and I think maybe I learned about it for the first time in kindergarten. You might be thinking, well, my high school class complicated that a little bit. I learned a little bit more. So think about where you are right now, and let's move forward with our conversation about Columbus. This little mini lecture is called Rediscovering Columbus, because we want to think about Columbus in different ways. We want to think about Columbus and not just the history of Columbus, what Columbus did in the past, but also how we've analyzed, interpreted Columbus over time, and how that analysis and interpretation has changed and recently in very dramatic ways. In the summer of 2020, the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officers sparked a wave of protests across the country. Statues, monuments of public history that serve as visible and daily reminders of what we choose to commemorate about the past, became a target of protesters. Symbols of the Confederacy like Robert E. Lee were covered in graffiti. Andrew Jackson, the infamous architect of the Trail of Tears, his statue was attacked by protesters in DC, and in New Orleans, city officials packed that statue up and put it away. And in several cities, Columbus became a target. In Boston, a Columbus statue was beheaded. In Richmond, Virginia, a statue was thrown in the lake. And here in Minneapolis, in this image, Columbus was toppled by members of AIM, the American Indian movement that started in the 1960s. And you'll notice that one protester said after toppling this statue, "He is gone, but we are still here." "We are still here" has become a rallying cry of members of the American Indian movement. How Columbus came to be a central figure in American history, how he came to be celebrated in the 20th century, and how he came to be seen as a symbol of white supremacy for many in the 21st century is a story of memory, commemoration, and historiography. What is historiography? That's probably a word you've never heard before. Put simply, historiography is the history of history. That's right, history as a field changes and develops over time. Now, you may see history as a static subject, one in which you can learn the entirety of and then not return to it again, trusting that a history class in 2020 and a history class in 2050 will be largely the same. But history is actually an active and a changing subject. Now, it's true, of course, that the past does not change. We have not yet invented time machines. But history is not the past. History is the study and interpretation of the past. The work of historians then is seemingly simple. Analyze and interpret primary sources to create a coherent argument or a story about the past. But the field changes based on several things: what primary sources are available, which primary sources a historian chooses to focus on, and what questions they ask of their primary sources. History is also always a reflection of the perspectives and priorities of its own time. Today, we'll look at a secondary source about Columbus and think about how the history of Columbus has changed. That is, how our understanding of and interpretation of the past has changed. This will prepare you to analyze primary and secondary sources about early encounters between Europeans and the first Americans, and it will also prepare you to consider alternate viewpoints of the encounter between Columbus and the Taino people in your first role play discussion. And this is going to carry this theme of Columbus, and interpretation of this history is going to continue into Module 1, where you're going to make an argument of your own. Let's cover some bare bones facts of the past. Now, interpretations can differ, but we have some facts that do remain the same. Christopher Columbus was born in Italy, and he sailed under the flag of Spain for Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. His goal in sailing was a western route to India that would end the trade monopoly of the wealthy and cosmopolitan caliphates of the Middle East. So they knew the world was round. You want to go east, go west and keep going, and eventually you'll get there. They knew the world was round, but they thought that it was a lot smaller, and they had no idea that the Americas existed. So in 1492, Columbus first came ashore of an island that he thought was India. This is the reason that Native Americans, indigenous people, First Peoples, are sometimes called Indians, from that confusion of Columbus. But he quickly named the island that he had encountered La Isla Española, later rendered Hispaniola. I just mispronounced that terribly. I'm going to try it again. La Isla Española, later rendered Hispaniola. Still bad, but a little bit better. The Taino people, who were there already, called their islands Ayiti, lands of the high mountains, which is also the source of the present day half of the island named Haiti. On this island, Columbus encountered the Taino Arawak peoples, and he also found gold. You know what followed: the enslavement of indigenous people, colonization, first by Spain as Cortez marched on the Aztec, then by Portugal, England, France, Russia, and the Netherlands. And you know that the demographic disaster of warfare and smallpox killed as much as 90% of that indigenous American population. Columbus's role in this history, and his role in our national remembrance of the story of the United States has changed over time. And Columbus Day itself has its own history. Columbus is a little bit of an odd figure in US history. He never set foot on the American mainland, and for many years he was one of many explorers in our textbooks, next to Cabot and Amerigo Vespucci. We take for granted now that Columbus is often the starting point of your US history textbook, but that's an idea that emerged only in the last century, and it emerged out of the desire of recent immigrants to be seen as true Americans. In the last half of the 19th century and the early 20th century, Italian immigration grew. And the masses of Italian immigrants who began arriving in America in the 1880s stood out. They looked differently than predominantly Northern Europeans who came before them. They were mostly poor farmers escaping starvation in Southern Italy. They had dark complexions, and many of them didn't speak English very well. They were frequently stereotyped as criminals, and the press stoked fears of Southern Italians as all being part of the Sicilian mafia. This anti-Italian discrimination occasionally created brutal acts of violence. In 1891, after the police chief of New Orleans was shot in the street, police rounded up 250 Sicilian immigrants without cause and tried 9 of them for murder. All of them were acquitted for lack of evidence. They had nothing to do with this. After that acquittal, though, a huge mob organized by the mayor of New Orleans stormed the prison and murdered all 9 men. They then strung up the mangled corpses of these men. This is one of the largest mass lynchings in American history. This mob justice was cheered on by most of America. The New York Times called these 9 men sneaking and cowardly Sicilians. They said they were the descendants of bandits and assassins who have come to this country as lawless, with their lawless passions, cutthroat practices, and oath-bound societies of their native country. They are a pest to the United States. Amidst this anti-Italian sentiment, which sometimes erupted into violence, prominent members of New York's Italian community had an idea. The nation was about to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, followed by the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago. They saw an opportunity then to align recent Italian American immigrants with the figure of Columbus. He sailed for Spain, but he was born in Italy. They created a statue and erected it in Central Park in New York City. In 1892, President Benjamin Harrison encouraged widespread observation of Columbus's arrival, calling him, quote, a pioneer of progress and enlightenment. It wasn't until 1968, though, that we came to have a uniform Columbus Day, officially designated as a federal holiday every second Monday in October. Early Italian immigrants then had a really good reason to align themselves with Columbus. It gave them part of the story of America. It allowed them to associate with this heroic American figure. But as modern historians have begun to spotlight the brutal side of Columbus's legacy, especially what he did to indigenous communities, we've seen increasing calls to abolish Columbus Day, replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day. You're going to talk more about that controversy in Module 1. Let's go back to this history of turning Columbus into a heroic American figure. That's not something that happened overnight, that this was an intentional project to position Columbus as the start of US history and to celebrate him as heroic. Columbus, as we know him then, was created as an answer to anti-immigrant violence and rhetoric in the 20th century, so he had to be heroic. This led to a depiction of Columbus that focused on his bravery and sense of adventure and ignored or downplayed primary sources that depicted his role in the enslavement of indigenous peoples. Ironically, oh, excuse me, I'm dying. Ironically, because this depiction focused on Columbus as a lone heroic figure, it also probably laid too much of the blame at his feet. Ample evidence supports the argument that subsequent conquistadors, including Cortez and others, were far more brutal than Columbus himself. But how was this heroic Columbus created? He was created through a myriad of secondary sources. Statues are a secondary source. They are making an argument about history. Public monuments and celebrations are themselves secondary sources. But Columbus was also transformed in the country's textbooks. So let's look now at a secondary source, a children's book from 1932. Now, I chose a children's book because it has great pictures. You might say, well, did you pick some low-hanging fruit? Did you cherry pick this one? Yeah, this one really does accentuate some of the misrepresentations of Columbus, but this is also an accurate reflection of textbooks at the time and scholarship at the time. So this isn't some weird outlier. This was the idea of Columbus circa 1932. I also want to pause here and talk about these textbooks as a secondary source, or these children's books, I should say. In 1932, this was a secondary source. It used primary sources, maybe misused some primary sources, and made a historical argument. For us then, we're looking at this as both a secondary source. It's making an argument about Columbus. But it's also for us in 2020, a primary source. If we change the question, if we ask, how has the historical understanding of Columbus changed over time? This textbook becomes a primary source that answers that question. So sometimes it's a little bit tricky. But first, let's look at it as a secondary source. What argument is this children's textbook making? Here we have Columbus, our heroic figure, arm upraised, standing on the, was that the bow? The bow of the ship. It says, Christopher, I guess we're on a first name basis. Christopher found one island after another. Whenever the Indians saw his boat coming, they would paddle out to meet him. They brought many presents. Standing up in their canoes, they would shout, chug, chug, chug. This was Indian for take, take, take. The book does get something right. Canoe is a Taino word. A lot of primary sources from Europeans focus on Native Americans that they encountered in what they called the New World, and they focused on their generosity. Now, we should understand that there's some truth to that. Indigenous people did practice generosity, but they practiced it largely as part of trade building, alliance building, network building. When someone new comes, someone powerful and interesting with all kinds of stuff that you haven't seen, you're going to want to create an alliance with them. What's the first step to creating an alliance? Generosity and friendship. But I would argue that as a secondary source, this children's book and textbooks and other scholarship frame this generosity as a way of answering an accusation that Columbus and Europeans stole anything. This says, how could they steal anything? Indigenous people couldn't wait to give everything they had away. And what did they have? Well, they had gold. This children's textbook talks about this gold. The farmers did not like to farm when they could do so better at gold hunting. These were the Europeans. They didn't want to farm, they wanted to find gold. Columbus himself was not satisfied with the small amount of gold he got from the streams and the mines of Haiti. He was tired of the wrangling and the grumbling of his men. So he went to the indigenous people and asked them, do you have any gold? But there wasn't a bit of gold to be had, so Columbus just left. This story that Columbus asked the chieftain, do you have gold? Chieftain said no, Columbus left. This is complicated or even belied if we look at other primary sources from Europeans from the time of conquest that depict what the Spanish did to first the Taino Arawak and later others if they did not bring back sufficient amount of gold, and then silver as we move into present day Mexico. These primary sources depict brutalities as people had their hands cut off, their bodies mutilated for failing to bring back sufficient amounts of gold. Our secondary source from 1932 ignores it, pretends it didn't happen, pretends that Columbus wasn't a part of it. I'd also like to point out that one of the things that this secondary source does is turns the Taino Arawak into Plains Indians. What is this headdress? These people ate alligators. They were not Plains Indians. But here we have indigenous people, Taino Arawaks, depicted in very, very stereotypical ways that would have made sense to largely white audiences in the 1930s. The very simplistic, of course, children's book is going to be complicated by your own reading of primary sources. Now you could say, well, Dr. Serafine, are we supposed to show this to children? No, I would not create a children's book that included Theodore de Bry's engraving. But that's another challenge for us to think about. How do you introduce children as young as kindergarten to difficult ideas? If this was the first thing you learn about Columbus, by the time you get to this in high school, you may feel as if you were lied to. So you're going to think about these primary sources and how they change that overly simple story of Mr. Christopher Columbus in our children's textbook. You're going to look at a couple of primary sources: Columbus's letter to King Ferdinand and Isabella from 1492 and 1493. You're also going to read King Ferdinand's letter to the Taino people that's about 10 years later. And think about, what do these letters tell us? Not about the Taino, but about Columbus, Ferdinand, and Isabella. How can we read them then against the grain a little bit? As they're describing the Taino, I'm going to challenge you to think about, how do those descriptions reflect back on the people who are writing? So that's your next step of work. You're going to evaluate some primary sources and a secondary source about a subsequent conquistador, Cortez, and La Malinche, who was instrumental in helping him succeed in toppling the Aztecs. So you're going to read a couple of primary sources, they're all short, and a secondary source that's also really short, and answer some questions about them. And then I'm challenging you a little bit to jump right into a role-playing activity that's a mock trial, the people versus Christopher Columbus and et al. That means, and everyone else that's in the defendants. One of the big takeaways that I hope you get from this activity is maybe our focus on Columbus is giving him too much credit or too much blame. So you'll think about that maybe as you enter the role play, before you read your roll sheet, or as you continue through the activity. The steps are outlined in that discussion. The discussion prompt, of course, is in this same module. And you each are assigned a role. You'll read your roll sheet, and then you'll mount a defense for your role. Now, you can also plead guilty if you decide that your role is responsible for this demographic disaster that killed about 90% of the indigenous population. You can say your role is guilty and explain why, but you also have to name a co-conspirator. You have to say who is guilty with you. If you say you're not guilty and explain why, you have to say who is guilty. You'll notice in the roll sheets, the Taino people themselves are indicted. And these roll sheets are written as an indictment, as an accusation. They may read to you as very unfair. That's kind of intentional. Then you're going to establish who you believe to be at fault, either blame someone else, name your co-conspirator. Please be respectful in your descriptions. Remember, these are real events and real people. And as you accuse each other, remember that you're also talking to a classmate as well as accusing Columbus's men. Some of the roles I tried to give to more than one person because I think they're difficult. I think the role of Columbus's men is a difficult role, and it will challenge you. All of the roles are challenging, and some of them may cause discomfort. The goal here is to create productive discomfort. What is productive discomfort? Productive discomfort challenges us to understand perspectives that are different from our own. not necessarily to agree with them. I will never require you to agree with me, agree with the roles, agree with the readings, agree with each other. That's never a requirement. But a deeper understanding of a perspective that's in opposition to your own will also deepen your own understanding of your own perspective. Now, watch out for points where discomfort becomes unproductive. If you think to yourself, there's no way I can defend this role, ask yourself why and use that in your response. This activity does make room for you to say, yes, my role is guilty, but it still asks you to understand what led them to those actions and who their co-conspirator is if you are guilty. You should also feel free to step out of character at the end of your discussion post, discuss your own perspective or your process of how you evaluated your role. Feel free just to say, okay, now I'm speaking as myself. Feel free to also say, this is what I think Columbus's men would say. It's entirely up to you if you want to speak in first person, me, Columbus, or to say, well, this is how I might argue as Columbus, or how Columbus might defend himself. That's entirely up to you how embodied into your role you want to get. All right, now this is the next module. You don't have to do this yet, but the next module is going to ask you to return to these questions and to make an argument. Yeah, I don't want to get in too deep into this. We're going to come back to module 1 and the module 1 reflection. You'll be able to peek ahead as soon as you finished this methods module. Remember that you have to get your green check marks next to everything in the module that's required, and that will let you move on to the next module. So if you're finding that you can't move on to the next module, but it's not locked, it's probably that you haven't got all of your little check marks yet. Let me go into student view for just a second. There we go. If you hear that scratching, it's my horrible cat. Okay. You'll see that there's little circles next to things that you have to complete. And once you've completed all of your required items, you'll be able to move into the next module. Now, the things to complete might be viewing something. So it might just be that you have to look at the overview before you can move on and get all your checks in this module. All right, so the rest of this module, you have your, oh my God, Smeagol, stop. She's a monster. You have your primary and secondary sources to evaluate. You have your Canvas discussion. Your additional resources here are just some things that we'll talk about mostly in the, I'm still in student view. Here we go. Optional, additional resources are actually a lot of stuff that we're going to talk about in the next module. But if you're just interested in more about what we talked about, if you're interested in the perspective of historians on those monuments coming down this summer, for instance, I have some resources for you here. So jump back into there we go, let's get out of that. Jump back into the rest of this historical methods module so you can start module 1 tomorrow. Next week, depending on which semester you're in. If you're in my winter semester, yeah, you're moving 1 module a day. I will see you in the next module for our next lecture of module 1, the first Americans to 1550. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful day. You stop being so bad. You're a monster.